Memento Mori Stories, a podcast that reminds us that we will die and that celebrates the deeply personal and sometimes whimsical ways we create to remember death and cherish life. How we bridge the gap, the sometimes deep, painful, and soul-searching gap between life and death. How we remember those we have loved, the things we keep, the phrases we use, the foods we prepare, the places we hold dear. This is your invitation to listen generously to one such story. A Memento Mori story.
When I start to think about what reminds me of a loved one who's no longer here, the answer for me really is quite simple. It's what I call friendship bread. And actually, I have a loaf on my kitchen counter right now, which I made just a couple days ago, that reminds me of my dad. My father, John Olcott, taught me how to bake as a teenager. Now, he's died nearly 30 years ago, so it's been quite a while. This is a round loaf that I'm looking at, and it was baked in a very unusual flower pot. My father was an art professor at the University of North Carolina. When my mother went back to work at UNC, it was Dad who took over her bread making. There would be my dad, and he would be at the kitchen counter, and he would sort of be expecting me because we did this ultimately many, many times, but he would have some yeast out, and he would have some bread flour out, and brown sugar, and molasses, some leftover oatmeal maybe from the morning, maybe a prize stick of Land O'Lakes butter. Anyway, all the ingredients would be out, and he would say, "Do you want to bake some bread?" Man, I was a teenager. I was angst-filled, and there were very trivial issues which bothered me. But as a teenager, of course, it's a big deal. So there Dad and I would be, and he would be measuring out some flour and adding some water to it and putting the yeast in, and I would be watching and helping. And I would be telling him about a crush that I had on some young boy, and he wasn't looking at me. Or, Dad would bring up issues, too, like I had some mice that I had for a science experiment that were in the house and in a cage, of course, but they had to go. And so, whatever the issue of the day was, we would talk about these things. It was fun. We would crank up the music, and I would dance while the KitchenAid was going back and forth, and clouds of flour were coming out. And Dad would make these 5 loaves, and all there were 2 regular pans, 2 smaller pans, and then there was this round clay flower pot. And my mother had gotten that idea from reading one of these decorating and cooking magazines. She was reading about some of the old clay utensils that were used for baking, centuries ago. And she thought, well, why not go to the garden store and get a clay flower pot? So that actually was the 5th baking item that was there. But one day the flower pot loaf disappeared, and when I looked around, I couldn't see it. And later that afternoon, I sort of pieced together what had happened. This is from my book, The Virtues of Cooking. It's a family memoir and cookbook. And it all has to do with virtues and bringing food out and attaching a virtue to that food. So pretty soon this bread became the virtue of friendliness. Dad probably gave away, I bet, well over 1,000 loaves of bread. I have continued that tradition. Both of my parents have passed away, and this tradition of making this bread and this act of friendliness, which is one of the virtues that I believe very strongly in, giving it away. And so of the last baking that I did, I gave away a loaf to my yoga teacher just to say a special thanks. And then I was scooting into the city to see my daughter, and so I took her a loaf. And it always starts a conversation with whoever gets it about, well, why is this a round loaf? Or how did you get the idea? Or why are you doing this? And so it reconnects me to this tradition of giving stuff away. Certainly is a way to reconnect and honor my parents and sort of feel like they're just around the corner with me. But it's also a way that I love in that it starts to build community and opens the door for different conversations to have with people, even people who I, thought I knew well, because all of a sudden I bring the bread, the conversation starts, and they tell me something that I wasn't expecting. And, it sort of deepens friendship. Very simple. Some hot bread out of the oven, reminding me of my dad, and of course my mom, who was the original baker.
Thanks for listening. Compassion and listening are so valuable in bringing healing to our lives after loss. So, how about you? Do you have a story about something that reminds you of a special someone, a beloved pet, an event, or a place that brings comfort? Please contact Memento Mori Stories through this podcast or our Facebook or Instagram pages. I would love to hear from you.